You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome to Autumn on the Air. Today, my guest is Derrick Maultsby Jr., a senior associate with Frost Brown in their data, digital assets, and technology practice group, corporate law practice group, and intellectual property group. Derrick serves as a business advisor and corporate transactional lawyers to startups, small to mid-sized businesses, and Fortune 50 companies. Derrick boasts a wide range of experience from commercial transactions and business advisement for startups and small businesses to serving as privacy counsel for institutional clients to mergers and acquisitions throughout the United States. Drawing from a diverse business and legal background, Derrick is dedicated to helping companies and communities grow intelligently and provides clients with effective and efficient solutions to challenging problems. Welcome, Derrick. I'm so excited to have you here on the air.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I'm very excited to have you here today, too, because we're going to talk everything about startup companies and founders. So we have a lot to talk about, so let's get into it. And as I mentioned, Derrick, you work with a lot of startup companies and founders that are spun out of universities. Can you tell us about some of the work you do and some of the universities and or companies you work with?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to speak in a bit of generalities here just because, it's not necessarily polite and sometimes can, breach confidentiality if I don't have the proper permissions to talk about the specific entities that I work with and how I work with them. But I get the opportunity to work with universities sort of in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic regions. So thinking Western Pennsylvania, the DMV area, Kentucky, Ohio, and throughout that region, and the university spinouts kind of range, in terms of the technology and the innovation in the industry. But I think the thing that I love the most is that the professors or potentially students that are working on these projects and that are attacking the innovation in whichever industry that they've decided upon, they all have similar needs, and those needs kind of more down to the corporate side of things and how to start a company, how to ensure that you're able to run the company in a legally compliant manner. How do you enter into agreements and raise money? And then also, how do you make sure you're obliging upon the license agreement that you have with your university?
Now, I'm curious, Derrick, working with universities like you do, can you talk a little bit about what tech transfer offices can do to help their founders get their startups up and running in the best position possible?
Yes. The best tech transfer offices that I work with bring the most resources that they can to their entrepreneurs, their professors, their students, the folks that are going to be attempting to spin out this venture and carry it on to success. And when I talk about resources, I mean resources and all that it looks like, and the education and all that it looks like. So for my perspective, it's the legal resources and education, but it could also be marketing. It could also be folks that have experience in fundraising and understanding what it takes to do that. Could be folks to help them understand what grants are out there for themselves, et cetera, and so forth. And so I think when you really look at what can a tech transfer office do, it's just setting that company up for success by giving them as much information as possible, introducing them and providing them with the resources that they need and the introductions that they need to go on and be successful and run a company. For some of these folks, and I mean, for a lot of these folks, this is the first time they've ever stepped out to do their own venture. So I think it's really important that, they have sort of a one-stop shop and sort of a business shaman, if you will, guiding them along the way.
Yeah, it's kind of like learning a new language and a lot of new languages, because like you mentioned, marketing, and then, if you're, getting funding and a whole bunch of other things. So there's a steep learning curve.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about some of the basic legal principles you think every founder should be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I gotta say, the folks at Frost Brown Todd would be happy with me saying, none of this is legal advice. And you should, if you're listening to this, you should 100% reach out to legal counsel before you do anything in which we're talking about on this podcast. But I think some of the basic legal principles are, to start, formation and understanding what entity structure you want to have and why you want to have it. And so when I'm meeting with founding teams, I oftentimes start with, what are your goals? What are you trying to do? Is this a social impact company? And are you trying to cause a greater good? Are you going to look for investment from traditional venture capitalists? Do you believe that there is a way to just grant fund your innovation and get it, commercialized and into the hands of the consumers? Is there potential partnerships with governments that you could look into that would help, get your product commercialized and fund it? There's so many different options out there. And so understanding those goals and understanding the vision of the founding team is what helps guide that initial process. And sometimes I meet founding teams and a part of the coaching is really, I don't think you all have sat down and thought through this enough to understand where you want to go. Then if you don't understand where you want to go, I'm not going to waste your time or your money by charging you for something that you may not need or that, may not serve you in getting to your goals. And so once we've identified those goals, let's say, for instance, it's a founding team that has a robotics technology and innovate and wants to innovate in manufacturing the industry. And they are looking to raise, 10, 20, $30 million in VC funding, as well as some grant funding to help commercialize their innovation and to go forward as a company. Well, that's great. So I know that more than likely they'll need to be a Delaware C Corp, and their structure will be set up as such, and we'll make sure that the filings are done appropriately, that they have all the proper corporate governance documents, their stockholder agreement, their corporate bylaws, their authorizing and founding resolutions. And then we'll also make sure that they have the agreements outside of the stockholder agreement between themselves. We'll also make sure that they have, IP assignments amongst themselves and other things to ensure that the company owns all the IP and owns and is able to go forward in raising funding and be set up appropriately and have all the proper protections in place. But if it's a social impact company that has an innovation that is focused maybe more of like a GovTech solution, and there's a lot of grant funding out there that the founding team believes that they can go and get, and they don't really see themselves needing to raise from venture capital firms, then an LLC or another form of an entity may be what's best for them, right? I think in that regard, I'd maybe suggest an LLC, and they could go forward under that corporate entity, and they would need the things under that corporate entity, such as an operating agreement and certain resolutions, and also they will still need IP assignments and all the things to make sure the company is protected and able to continue forward without any harm from anybody from the founding team, having a change in circumstances and things like that. And so once you get through that beginning part and you have the entity formed and you have your founder documents in place, those IP assignments and the equity agreements between the company and the founders, Then you start to think about other basic blocks, which is external. I call that initial part internal legal, building blocks. Then you have the external, and that's if you're going to use a third party developer, or if you're going to use a third party marketing firm, or investors, if you're going to take angel investment. Well, all of these things need to have agreements in place. Unfortunately, I have founders that come to me all the time and they say, hey, I have such and such developing out my mobile app or developing out my technology. And I ask, well, where's the service agreement that has the IP assignment in it and has, the independent contractor status provision in it and all those other protections? And they say, oh, I just have this scope of work that I signed. And the scope of work obviously doesn't have any of those things, right?
Yeah.
And so, hopefully and usually the service provider is also just an entrepreneur who doesn't have maybe the proper legal team on their side. There's no actual harm or foul being done, and they're willing to sign something and continue on the work. But sometimes that's not what happens, and that's a huge liability, right? And so it's just making sure that you're papering and you're protecting your company and yourself from those third parties, those external parties, appropriately. And I think if you break it down and you think about the internal and the external, it becomes pretty simple, and it seems not that hard, but these founders are wearing so many hats, and especially with the university spinouts, some of these folks still have course loads,
day jobs,
in teaching, right, and teacher requirements.
Definitely.
So they're wearing so many hats. They're trying to move their company forward, and they're doing the best they can. And I think that comes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, which is it's just making sure as a tech transfer office that you've provided these folks with resources to be successful, and you've put the proper things in place for them to lean on certain resources and certain guidance to know what to do and not feel overwhelmed and not make simple mistakes that can be easily avoided.
Yeah, and I really like the way you described it, Derrick, of internal legal building blocks and external legal building blocks, because I think that really makes it very clear to kind of understand them. And I'm curious, with all the work that you've done with founders, founding teams, and startups, obviously there are legal challenges that are associated with that. Can you talk about some of the common legal mistakes you've seen among founders and founding teams and startups and how they can avoid them?
Yeah, so I already kind of touched on, maybe starting the wrong entity. And when I talk about starting the wrong entity, the one that you see the most is founding team. They will go and they will work with business attorney that they know or in town or something along those lines. And the business attorney is giving them the proper advice for a small business, but not for a venture-backed startup, because the business attorney doesn't understand, the nuances of a venture-backed startup, right? And they say to them, well, oh, it's just you, you two as co-founders. I really think from a tax standpoint and from a business standpoint, it makes sense for you to be a limited liability company, an LLC. Well, that's fine, and everything's fine, and they're moving on forward just fine until they go to raise money from a venture capital firm, and the VC firm tells them, well, you have to convert. And they go, oh, this is maybe the first they're hearing of it, or they've been hearing people say that at, accelerators or pitch competitions or whatever they've been doing as they get more involved in the ecosystem. And then they get to a point where they realize, okay, we were set up for the wrong purpose, right? It goes back to that understanding your goals and your purpose. We were set up for the wrong purpose. We cannot achieve this goal without being a Delaware C Corp. And so then, they come to a person like myself who then converts their company and sets their company up for what they need it to be, to then go and raise that money from traditional venture capital firms. To keep within that example, you have these two co-founders who were set up as an LLC, and they didn't enter into IP assignments. And let's also say they didn't enter into, founder agreements, such as, how the founder is going to get their equity from the company. And one of those co-founders, not being malicious, has a change of circumstances, a new job across the country, something happens in their family, such as, a birth of a new child or something along those lines, and they cannot meet the requirements of a co-founder anymore. But they also don't want to give up their equity, and they become difficult to work with. Well, now what has happened is, a year or 2 years into building your product, you have a huge liability in a co-founder that's, holding equity that is dead cap space on dead space on your cap table, and also is a liability in terms of they could just walk away and start their own company with the same IP because they haven't executed an IP assignment, an IP transfer. They've just been developing the IP, developing the marketing, developing the business model with you, but there's no paper between them and the company that says who owns the IP. Now, the other piece of this is that the IP is being licensed to you from the university, right? And so, there's a level of issue that comes into your liability that you may have back to your university in terms of having this co-founder in that circumstance. And so it creates a mess of issues, I guess, is the answer to say here. And I think in trying to just get rid of these issues, it goes back to resources, it goes back to education, and it goes back to, getting the right advisement as early as possible to make sure that these issues don't arise and that all these things are put in place early on. Because if you don't know, founders don't know what they don't know. And this is, a world of nuances and details and a bunch of documents that seem meaningless and useless at the time. But once you need it and you don't have it, it's too late. And you put yourself in a difficult situation, and you put yourself potentially at the, liberty of someone else.
And I think, you made a great point about getting that legal advice early. And I think that's a great segue to what I wanted to ask you, because I know from talking with you that one of the services you provide is as a general counsel for startups, which I think a lot of startups don't think that they need, but I think it's a great way to avoid some of these mistakes that you were just mentioning. And I'm sure, you've done this for a number of startups. You've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And why don't we start off talking a little bit about some of the good things that you've seen in terms of best practices that you've seen startups develop and how they've successfully navigated the first 5 years after founding. So basically, what have you seen that startups have done well?
Yeah. I think organization. I also think that communication and delegation. So the founders that I have seen succeed have an immense level of all three of those things. So when you look at organization, they know exactly where they want to go. They have it planned out, mapped out. They're revisiting their strategy, and they are then delegating pieces of that strategy to their team members, which then requires an immense level of communication. All of this is strategic operations, and that's something that all founders don't necessarily thrive at. And so I think another piece of it is for founding teams to understand the strengths of their co-founders and to lean into those strengths, and where there are holes and where there are gaps, work with the folks in their tech transfer office or the other folks in their ecosystem to help fill those gaps, or to help learn about those gaps, and put the proper people there, or begin to look for the proper resources that could help supplement those gaps, understanding that a lot of these companies are going to be cash strapped up front and can't just hire and build teams at will. So that to me is a major differentiator. More so than the innovation, right? Have this conversation all the time. I think being able to be an incredible founder is more important than having necessarily an incredible technology sometimes, because if the founder isn't doing things the right way and isn't able to tell the story of the company, then nobody will know how great the technology is. So, I think you see great founders and great founding teams have amazing success with innovation and technology that's maybe not that great, right? Or not that cutting edge, or something that you wouldn't expect to be, as big of a hit or have as much, investment into it. And then you see companies that have these amazing technologies, and you're like, how is this not being invested in more, or how is this not blowing up? And you kind of can maybe tail that back to there being a deficiency from an operations side, or marketing side, or the strategic plan of the company. And that comes back to, the founders have these deficiencies, aren't maybe communicating well, are not, organized, or not planning and executing on their plan in a way that is setting them up for that success.
Let's move on to the bad and ugly, because I'm sure you've seen a lot of that too. What are the things you've seen that have killed a startup?
Yeah, I think some of the things that kill startups, I've mentioned a few earlier, and the one earlier that really I think kills startups is founder disputes. I think that can kill a startup if the proper paperwork isn't in place, and can cause major issues when someone with a lot of equity in a company no longer is an active participant and holds the company hostage via their equity. That is a really tough issue to get around, and if it happens at a certain inopportune time, then you might not have the financial resources to be able to get yourself out of it if the proper paperwork isn't in place. The other things that can kill startups, outside of just the founders themselves not wanting to continue forward, is taking on too much money, and not focusing, raising more than you're building your product. Eventually you do need to be building your product, and not building a product is going to eventually come to it's all going to come to a head. Vice versa, you got to have the money, and you have to have the financial resources to build your product. So companies that aren't raising, and their runway is getting shorter and shorter, that will also obviously kill a startup and kill a company. The other piece is obviously is the IP piece, and this falls a bit into what I talked about a little bit earlier with co-founders, but it can be in other realms too. You want to protect your IP, and in protecting your intellectual property, I look at it in two ways, again, internal and external. The internal, we talked about the IP assignments that you want to have your founding team members sign. As you grow your team, as you grow your company, you want to make sure as a part of the onboarding process, you have those IP assignments, sort of automated. And that's the internal sort of soft protection of IP. And externally, you want to do a very similar thing in developer agreements. We talked about the third party agreements. You want to make sure you're also protecting that IP. And then you do want to have the proper protections around your brand and around the marks or the technology. So talking about patents and trademarks. And I'm not an IP lawyer. I work closely with our IP team, but that's something you do want to start to think about early. The patent process takes a long time. The trademark process does not take as long. However, it's important to think about that early on, because sometimes it may require you to change something about your company, specifically if a name of a product or a name of your company is already trademarked in a similar industry or for a similar use, that may change your strategy. And so it's good to know that as early on as possible. And if you get far along enough and you've already invested so much into that brand and it's actually not a brand that you can maybe utilize in that way, that is something that can be, financially straining on a company and potentially ruin a company.
I have definitely seen that. I mean, it seems like founders and founding teams understand patents and filing, but a lot of times the brand name, the trademark name gets overlooked and they'll start using a product name or a trademark as a company name and not do any searching. And that, like you said, comes back to bite them later. And it can be a very expensive undertaking to have to change names or if you get sued. So completely agree with you on that one.
Absolutely.
So, Derrick, I wanted to ask you about investments and potential investors. And I know this is something you've seen a lot of. So for startups that are seeking investment, becoming investment ready, as you know, is really crucial. What advice do you have for startups to put their best foot forward and attract potential investors?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I would say is a Lauryn Hill quote, which is, "How are you going to win if you aren't right within?"
Great quote.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I was at Black Tech Week last week, and I said that in my talk, and everybody applauded. And it took me a while to catch my spacing again. But if you aren't set up right, if you aren't ready to go, then you're going to fall apart when you finally get to that point of investment. Now, there are companies and there are founders that investors will work with, and early enough on, investors will work with you to help you get to where you need to be. But it also can be a turnoff to investors that you don't have, the proper corporate form, or, you don't have the founder documents in place, or, there's certain liabilities like developer agreements that don't have, the proper IP language and so on and so forth. So you eventually you do need to be right within, and you do have to have everything together. You're not going to be able to fake it till you make it, per se. The other piece of this is, I think, understanding what you're looking for. And this comes back again to goals. You need to know how much money you're raising. Why are you raising that money? What are you going to do with that money? And you have to have a clear understanding for that. These are questions and these are things that investors are going to ask. And if you don't have the answers to it, that also can cue to them that maybe you're a little premature and you haven't thought through this yet. And you aren't going to utilize the money in a way that is going to help you be successful. Lastly, and I tell this to all founders, and I want to tell this to tech transfer officers so they can tell this to founders, not all money is good money. And just because an investor is offering you something, or whether it's an angel investor or a VC firm, if you don't see these as people that are going to add value to you, to your company, you don't really want their input, you don't value their input, then that might mean to not take that check and to not give them the equity that they would receive in exchange for their investment. Because at the end of the day, your investors are a part of your journey, one way or another. And if they're going to become a nuisance or a problem for you, or you don't feel as if you want them in the boat with you, then it may be best to, as hard as it is sometimes, say no to that investment. And that's something that I don't think a lot of founders early on really, do. And that's partially because they need the investment, they need the money. And there will be decisions at times where you have to take money from people you don't necessarily maybe would have if you didn't need the money. And I understand that. But if you can say no to money in a circumstance like that, where you do not feel comfortable with those investors, you don't feel like you want them in the boat with you, then that's the best thing for you, and that's the best thing for you to do for your company.
Absolutely. I think that's really great advice. And I think that's a good segue to my next question for you, Derrick, because you and I are both keenly aware that legal advice is expensive, and many startups think that they can avoid legal costs by doing things themselves, using form agreements and things like that, and drafting their own patent applications or drafting their own agreements. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, I come across this a lot, and I do believe that founding teams are really, really smart, right? I say to my clients all the time, you are very smart, likely much smarter than I am. But the one thing that I might know a few things about that you don't, and some of my colleagues might know a few things about that you don't, is legal work. And I do understand the attractiveness to try to do a lot of things by yourself and try to take templates online and form them to what you need them to be. But here's the issue. You don't know what you don't know. There are things in those agreements or things that you're writing that you might think mean something, but they mean something different in a certain context in relation to another provision that's either there or not there earlier in the agreement. In the patent process, it's such a long, tedious process, and it truly is hard to get a patent, right? You can be patent pending, but it is hard to get a patent. It's not easy, and it's not cheap, and I understand that. But you get the most value out of delegating these tasks to people that can do them well. And so if you're in a position where you can budget for or find the resources to help you with these items from people that are, trained to do this work, then that's the best use not only of your time but of your resources of the company. And it's not a good use of your time, and ultimately you might end up losing money or spending more money trying to do things yourself to save a certain amount of money. But I also can appreciate folks that are early on, they don't have the financial resources and they know that they need to do these things. I can appreciate where they're coming from. But if you absolutely can do anything where you can pool the financial resources to have legal help as early on as possible, you should do that. That is just the right thing to do, and it'll ensure that you're set up for the level of success that hopefully you'll end up achieving.
Yeah, I completely agree with the comments you just made. I think that's really good advice. And I have seen where it's cost more to correct mistakes versus if it had just been done correctly from the beginning. So, Derrick, as the podcast comes to a close, I wanted to ask you, I know diversity, equity, and inclusion is a topic that's very important to you. Can you share your thoughts on the need for more diversity in terms of female and minority founders as well as VCs?
Absolutely. The minority innovation ecosystem is just it's so important. It's important to me as a Black attorney, and I think that we as a society, we owe it to ourselves to all invest in the minority innovation ecosystem, because the more that we invest in diverse perspectives, the more that we invest in innovation coming from diverse people, I think the more problems we'll solve collectively. There are problems that are unique to all types of different perspectives. There's innovation that will be impactful to a certain ecosystem or a certain demographic or population. So I think it's so important that we continue to invest in different voices, in different perspectives because of that. And I do believe that it's also important that we have representation at every level of this ecosystem. So whether it's service providers like myself, whether it's in tech transfer offices, whether it's investors, like you said, who are looking for diverse talent and innovation, it's important that the entire ecosystem represents the founders and ultimately the individuals throughout our country that will be impacted by this innovation. It is growing, but we're not there yet. And we have to continue pushing forward. And it, coming from a conference last week, like Black Tech Week, it's so inspiring to see all of the Black and brown faces that were in those rooms and the innovation that folks are working on. But at the same time, it's taking that, it's taking the inspiration from that and knowing that we need to keep pushing forward, we need to keep moving forward, and we need to keep investing in that ecosystem to ensure that it only continues to grow. And the statistics around the dollar amount that Black, brown, LGBTQ plus, women-led startups continue to rise in terms of the investment dollars they raise and in terms of the successful exits that ultimately occur.
Absolutely. Derrick, it was a pleasure having you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and advice on startup creation and growth.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. I really do hope that anybody listening to this can learn something from it. And I pride myself in trying to be as accessible as possible. And if I can ever be of any assistance and provide any further education or resources to anyone, I would love to do so.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at autm.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.
New to tech transfer or a seasoned pro? Autumn is the global member organization for tech transfer and is here to help you get connected, get smart, and get ahead. Whether you work in academia, research, government, business development, corporate engagement, or startups, Autumn is dedicated to supporting you through education, advocacy, networking, and promotion. Join and you'll receive 20 free live webinars, as well as meaningful discounts on meetings and courses, insider access to a vast network of colleagues to help you through challenges, and align on new technologies and the university decision makers who license them. Membership is open for 2023. Join us.